Hey guys, welcome to the Fairellia Files. I am Faye, and this is where I explore the unsolved and unearthly. Each week, I delve into the mysteries of a new haunted location, urban legend, or unsolved mystery. This week, I'll be taking you on a tour of the haunted Sallie House. Stay tuned to hear about the little girl named Sallie who haunts the house, and the pentagram that was found in the basement. This house is said to be one of the most haunted houses in America and possibly the world. But first, I would like to thank Robinhood for sponsoring this episode. If you're in the market for making more money, then give Robinhood a try. I easily made a few $100 in stocks without having to know much about what I was doing. You can use the link in the description below to get between $5 and $200 in stocks for free to get started investing and making some extra cash. Haunted locations like the Sallie House in Atchison, Kansas are typically rooted in the history of the land and the location. So before we tour the house and talk about the hauntings, I want to talk about the history. It starts in 1867 when Michael Finney bought the land and built what we now call the Sallie House. Michael and his wife Catherine had 3 kids, James, Agnes, and Charles. But after taking 4 years to build the house, Michael only got to live in the house for about a year before he passed away. Sadly, Catherine was pregnant at the time, and the 4th child, Edwin, only survived for 2 years. After a few years, James, the eldest son, built a second home on the property, probably for him to move into as, like I said, he was the eldest. But after finishing the home, he ended up moving to St. Louis to take a manufacturing salesman job. He was really good at it too. Now let's talk about the youngest son, Charles. He was a champion figure skater. He would enter all the contests and he'd usually win. But he realized that he was a bit feminine and no one could really tell whether he was male or female when he was on the ice. So he'd also enter the skating contest as Miss Colby of Baltimore. But when he was found out, they would openly ban him on the contest announcements, like saying, "Announcement is open to everyone but C. Finney." But to make an income, he was also working at a local doctor's office as an office assistant and bookkeeper. So no longer being allowed to compete, he took the advice of his employer, Dr. Holland, and went to medical school. He became a doctor, and after getting his degree in 1894, he opened his own practice. A few years after Charles moved back home, Catherine, his mother, ended up renting the homes that James, his brother, had built to a single mother who was recently divorced and had 3 kids. I guess the family felt bad for Joanna and her situation because Joanna was mentally unstable. She'd been in and out of the state hospital for years, and not long after moving into the home, she was committed again for being violently insane, based on the testimony of her neighbors. This time, she was pregnant with her 4th child. Once the baby Frank was born, Joanna was released from the hospital and into the care of none other than Charles Finney. At that time, she moved back into the neighboring house that James had built. Around the same time that Frank was born, James, Charles's older brother who had left to do the manufacturing salesman job 9 years ago, he finally lost his battle with neurosyphilis, which happens when the STD syphilis goes untreated and infects the brain. Although the family would visit him in St. Louis, there doesn't seem to be much contact with him throughout that time, so I really feel like this hit the family kinda hard. After his brother's death, Charles met his wife Louise, and they built a 3rd home on the property, this time on the opposite side of his childhood home. They had a son, who they named Charles as well, and like his father, he'd grow up to be a doctor and share his father's practice. Okay, so now we're going back to Joanna's story. I know we're jumping around a bit, but bear with me. So after a few years of renting the Finneys' home, Joanna ends up remarrying her husband and moving back home with him and her children. But only a few months later, she decided to turn on the gas stove and went to lay down to take a nap with now 6-year-old Frank. Overcome by fumes, Frank died, but Joanna survived. It's assumed that she was attempting to kill herself and her 6-year-old son. Although this doesn't occur on the property, some believe it's relevant to the hauntings. Agnes, on the other hand, had gone off and married a railroad engineer named William True. After 3 years of being married, they went on a vacation in Wyoming. But sadly, while they were there, William suffered a stroke. Agnes brought him back home to her brother, the doctor, for medical care. But after being unconscious for 3 days, he passed away at the family home. Only a month later, Catherine, their mother, would pass away in the neighboring home of septicemia. Charles had been treating her for gangrene for a while, but was unsuccessful. After her husband and mother's death, Agnes moved back home and into the house that her brother James had built. She died in the home 20 years later after being sick for months. Oddly enough, Charles, who the story seems to revolve around, didn't pass away on the property, but in a nearby city called Topeka. After the Finney family, the land seems to have gotten split between the 3 homes, and this is where our story really comes to focus on the Sallie House, which is the one that was Charles's childhood home. There were a handful of owners, including the Mize family, who had a daughter named Sarah Margaret, but went by the name Sallie. For unknown reasons, they didn't stay long in the home. It wasn't until 1992, when the Pickmans moved in, that any paranormal activity was openly reported. After experiencing paranormal things occurring, they were featured on the ghost show Sightings in efforts to help stop the activity in the home. One night, Tony had a vivid nightmare about a spirit who resided in the home, and he drew what he had seen in the dream. After having a psychic medium come to the home, he finally had a name for the little girl. The medium said her name was Sallie, and that she complained of stomach pains and a toothache. Now, other than Sallie Mize, there were no other Sallies that lived in the home, and no one named Sallie died in the home. There is a legend that a mother brought her 7-year-old daughter to Dr. Charles Finney's home because of horrible stomach pains. After examining the girl, he determined that the cause of the horrible stomach pains was acute appendicitis, and that if he didn't operate immediately, her appendix was going to burst. So he brought her into the kitchen, and before the anesthesia could take effect, he began operating on the poor child. I can't even imagine how much pain this child was in during this procedure. Sadly, she didn't survive and was said to have died in the kitchen. There's nothing that documents this event in history, but in the early 1900s, this could have totally happened. He was a doctor. So a second interconnected theory also exists, and that is that this girl was his illegitimate child, and the mother brought her to Dr. Finney's house because she wasn't allowed to go to the hospital for fear that Charles's affair would be found out. And after Sallie died during the operation, some say that Dr. Finney killed the mother as well and buried them both in the backyard. Again, only theory and legend. But both bring us back to the Sallie House and its hauntings. So before we tour the house and talk about the hauntings in each room, let's take a quick break. Okay, we're back, and it's time to talk about the hauntings in the Sallie House. Before we do, I want to ask for your help. If you would drop a comment about your most haunting paranormal experience below, I'd love to feature your story on the podcast. If you'd rather not talk about it, then hit that like and subscribe button and keep hearing about these unsolved and unearthly experiences. So the home is a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 2-story house. It's not a mansion, but you do need to sign a waiver before you begin the tour or stay overnight, as the Pickmans reported being attacked by entities in the home. Tony Pickman was the main target of the ghostly attacks, and his wife Deborah and the newborn baby were pretty much left alone. Some think that the spirits that haunt the house have something against men because of this. Before the break, I talked about the legend of Sallie and her operation in the kitchen. So let's start there. Aside from the operation, kitchens are known to be hotspots for paranormal activity because of things like running water and stone countertops, which are great conductors of energy. Also, kitchens are the least likely room in the home to drastically change. During renovations, a lot of people give the kitchen a facelift, but most renovations don't include moving things like the sink or wall cabinets, so the kitchen is usually the most familiar setting for spirits. In the Sallie House, we have the possibility that a young girl died in excruciating pain. Now, there are reports of cold spots throughout the kitchen, and Tony Pickman reported that one day when he came home, he went to the fridge for a glass of milk, and as he was about to take a sip, he noticed that a startled little girl wearing a white dress from the 1800s was staring at him. Startled himself, he dropped the glass of milk he was holding and ran over to tell his wife. Moving into the living room, we have reports of fires. During the Pickman son's birthday party, a doll that was sitting in a chair by itself spontaneously caught fire. Other reports of fire have come from guests in the house, like the curtains catching fire with no ignition source. The basement is always haunted. They just are. They're creepy and haunted. But in the case of the Sallie House, there might be more going on. In the early 2000s, the tenant who rented the house after the Pickmans drew a pentagram on the floor of the basement, and he was trying to summon the demon Beelzebub, who's a prince of hell when you think of it in demonology, or to some Christians, it's another name for Satan. When the owner found it, he spray painted over this with black paint, and you can still see the black paint and kind of faintly see the pentagram when you look in the basement. But even before this, the basement felt off. The Pickmans believed that a dark entity resided in the hole at the back of the basement, and that it was attached to the land. Spirits being attached to the land is nothing new when it comes to hauntings, and it's usually traced back to a curse on the land. In this case, the Kaw Indian tribe once resided here. Now, I'm not saying that all Native Americans put curses on the land when they were pushed out by the American settlers, but if I were them, wouldn't you? Before we move into the bedrooms, let's swing up to the attic. The only real thing of note in the attic was a sweater that was discovered hidden under some of the insulation. This sweater was covered in blood around the waist area and had 2 puncture holes in it, one in the front, one in the back. When they found it, they did an investigation of the entire house, and that's what leads us to the bedrooms. Of the 3 bedrooms, one was used as a nursery, the other's the master bedroom, and a third was probably used for guests. In the master bedroom, under where the bloody sweater was found in the attic, a luminol test found that there was blood spatter in the closet. Luminol is what the cops use when they are looking for blood spatter or blood stain. They just lightly spray it and it kind of makes the blood glow, like glow in the dark. So that's what they were using, and they found that blood spatter in the closet. And it's not known when this blood spatter came about, but people have reported that they feel dizzy when they're in the master bedroom near the closet. So my theory is that if the person wearing the sweater bled out, it would have caused a dizzy feeling that a ghost may be trying to share with someone. In the nursery, the Pickmans had a few stories to tell. The first was that upon moving in, their dog would growl at something in the nursery that they couldn't see. It happened over and over and over again. There was something in there that the dog just didn't like. One day, after being out all day, the Pickmans came home to find all of the teddy bears in the nursery arranged in a circle on the floor. After picking up the teddy bears and putting them away, a little confused, they left the room. And later that night, Tony felt a burning on his back and later discovered 3 large scratches running down his back. After this happened a few times, they stopped using the nursery because they didn't want anything to happen to their baby. But then the neighbors would start asking, why are you leaving your lights on in the nursery all night? But they weren't. They weren't even using the nursery. They never turned the lights on. So who turned them on? As we walked down the stairs to the front door, it said that toys move on their own in the stairwell and the hallway. Well, throughout most of the house it really seems. Tony would also get scratches that would appear on his body no matter what room he was in. Some think that this is from the ghost of Sally's mother, who disliked men because Dr. Finney killed her and her daughter to hide the affair. Others say that it's the ghost of Joanna, who had violent tendencies and takes it out on the men in the house. So after touring the Sallie House and hearing about its history and legends, what do you think? It's said to be one of the most haunted houses in the US, and thousands of accounts of paranormal activity have backed up what the Pickmans had happening. But none of it started until the Pickmans moved in. So what's really causing the hauntings? Is it a little girl named Sallie who died after the operation? Or is it something darker, something demonic? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if you visited the Sallie House, I want to hear about it. And don't forget to drop your most haunting paranormal experience in the comments to get featured on the podcast. I'll see you guys next week with another episode on Emily Saget, a school teacher who was fired 19 times because of a doppelganger that she couldn't even see herself.